The American Civil War was more than just a conflict between North and South. It was the very unraveling of a nation-a war that tested the strength of democracy, the meaning of freedom, and the limits of human endurance. From 1861 to 1865, battlefields soaked in blood would decide the fate of the United States. This war was not fought in some faraway land. It was fought in the heart of America, on farms, in forests, in towns where families once lived side by side. Neighbors became enemies. Brothers fought against brothers. And the echoes of cannon fire would haunt the nation for generations. The story of the Civil War is one of division, sacrifice, and ultimately, transformation. By its end, slavery would be abolished. But at a terrible cost, more than 600,000 Americans dead, and millions more scarred forever. Before the first shot was fired at Fort Sumter, the nation had already been simmering with tension for decades. To understand the war itself, we must first understand what brought America to the brink of destruction. In the mid-1800s. America was a nation split in two, only by geography, but by ideals. The North was industrializing, pushing forward with factories, railroads, and wage labor. The South, on the other hand, was rooted in a system of plantations that depended on enslaved labor. Cotton was king, and the South's economy thrived. On the backs of enslaved African Americans, the moral question of slavery had long haunted the United States. Could a country founded on liberty truly allow millions of men, women, and children to be treated as property? The North said no. The South defended the institution fiercely, claiming their way of life depended on it. The divide grew sharper as the United States expanded westward. Would new territories be free or slaveholding? Each new state threatened to tip the balance of power in Congress. Violence erupted in Kansas. Senators fought on the floor of the Senate itself. America was breaking apart. And then came the election of 1860. Abraham Lincoln, a Republican who opposed the spread of slavery, was elected president. To the South, this was unacceptable. 11 Southern states seceded from the Union, declaring themselves a new nation, the Confederate States of America, led by Jefferson Davis. The stage was set. The Union vowed to preserve the nation. The Confederacy vowed to defend its independence. Neither side could back down. War was inevitable. April 12, 1861, Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. The air was tense as Confederate cannons opened fire on Fort Sumter, a Union stronghold. The sky lit with explosions, smoke filled the harbor. And America's deadliest war had begun. For 34 hours, Confederate artillery pounded the fort. The Union soldiers inside, low on supplies, eventually surrendered. No one died in the bombardment itself, but its impact was far-reaching. The North was outraged. President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. The response was overwhelming. Young men flooded recruitment offices, eager to fight for their cause. In the South, men rallied just as strongly. Families sent their sons to defend their land and their way of life. Both sides believed the war would be short. Both were wrong. That summer, the Union Army marched into Virginia, confident in a quick victory. On July 21, 1861, at the First Battle of Bull Run, they met Confederate forces near a small creek. Civilians from Washington came with picnic baskets to watch, expecting a show. What they saw was chaos. The Union troops, inexperienced and disorganized, broke under pressure. Confederate reinforcements arrived, and Union soldiers fled in panic, tripping over abandoned wagons, dropping weapons as they ran. The first major battle of the war was a Confederate victory, and the North realized the conflict would not be easy. Meanwhile, families were torn apart. Brothers and cousins fought on opposite sides. Letters from the battlefield spoke of fear, courage, and homesickness. America was bleeding, and it had only just begun. The year 1862 brought the grim reality of war crashing down upon both North and South. Gone were the illusions of a short, glorious conflict. The battlefields of this year would reveal the staggering cost of civil war measured in blood, mud, and human suffering. The Union's new strategy was clear: split the Confederacy in two by seizing the Mississippi River, and launch offensives deep into Southern territory. Leading the way was a man whose name would become legendary: Ulysses S. Grant. In early April, Union forces clashed with Confederates in Tennessee at the Battle of Shiloh. The dawn attack caught Union troops by surprise. Confederate soldiers surged out of the woods, their battle cries echoing through the mist. Chaos swept the Union camp. Soldiers fled half-dressed, some without weapons. The ground turned red as wave after wave of men collided. General Grant.com, under fire, refused to give in. Reinforcements arrived, and by the second day, the Union Army pushed back, forcing the Confederates to retreat. But victory came at a terrible price. More than 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. Shiloh shocked the nation. This was not a gentleman's war. This was slaughter on an industrial scale. As the months passed, the bloodshed only grew worse. The Union Navy, under Admiral David Farragut, captured New Orleans, securing a crucial victory and cutting off Confederate trade through the Gulf of Mexico. Control of the Mississippi was tightening, but the most pivotal moment of 1862 came in September at a quiet town in Maryland called Sharpsburg. The Battle of Antietam would be remembered as the bloodiest single day in American history. September 17, 1862. Dawn broke over Antietam Creek. Mist hovered over the cornfields as Union and Confederate troops stared each other down. The first shots rang out, and the fields became killing grounds. For hours, men charged into withering fire. Cornstalks were shredded by bullets. Cannon smoke filled the air until the sun was blotted out. At a sunken road, later called Bloody Lane, Confederate soldiers held their ground as Union waves crashed against them. The lane became a trench filled with bodies. By midday, Union forces attacked a stone bridge over Antietam Creek. Confederate sharpshooters rained down fire, but the Union pressed forward, taking the bridge at terrible cost. The fighting raged until nightfall, when the smoke cleared. More than 22,000 men lay dead, wounded, or missing. The battle was tactically a stalemate, but strategically it changed everything. Lee's invasion of the North had been stopped. The Confederates were forced to retreat back into Virginia. For Lincoln, this was the moment he had been waiting for. He saw an opportunity to give the war a new purpose. Up until now, the Union had fought to preserve itself, but now, the war would become a struggle for human freedom. In the quiet of his office, Abraham Lincoln drafted a document that would redefine the war in the nation. On January 1, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation would officially take effect. It declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were free. Though it could not immediately liberate every enslaved person, it transformed the war into a moral crusade. No longer was it just about preserving the Union, it was about ending slavery. The proclamation also struck a blow to the Confederacy's hopes of foreign support. European nations, particularly Britain and France, had considered recognizing the Confederacy. But with the Union now fighting against slavery, it became politically impossible for European powers to back the South, for enslaved men and women across the South. The Emancipation Proclamation was a beacon of hope. Many fled plantations to join Union lines, some enlisting in the Union Army. By the end of the war, nearly 200,000 African Americans would serve in the Union cause, fighting not just for freedom, but for the future of their people. But the war was far from over. 1863 would test both sides with battles so fierce they would decide the fate of the nation. Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and a speech that would echo through history, the Gettysburg Address. Asterisk. The year 1863 was the crucible of the Civil War, the moment when the tide began to turn. For 2 years, both sides had fought with staggering losses, yet neither could claim decisive victory. The Union sought to strangle the Confederacy with blockades and sieges, while the South hoped to break Northern morale with daring offensives. The war reached its climax in the summer of 1863, in the small Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg. This was where destiny itself seemed to hold its breath. Asterisk, July 1, 1863. The hills and fields of Gettysburg came alive with the thunder of cannon fire. Confederate General Robert E. Lee, emboldened by victories in Virginia, launched his second invasion of the North. His army of 75,000 men swept into Pennsylvania, hoping to strike a blow that might force the Union to negotiate peace. On the first day, Confederate forces clashed with Union cavalry. By nightfall, the Union Army had fallen back to defensive positions on Cemetery Hill. The stage was set for a battle that would decide the fate of the war. Day 2 brought chaos on the rocky slopes of Little Round Top. Union Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and his men from Maine held the line against repeated Confederate assaults. Running low on ammunition, Chamberlain ordered a desperate bayonet charge, sweeping the Confederates back and saving the Union flank. Day 3, July 3rd, saw one of the most famous moments in military history: Pickett's Charge. Confederate soldiers, 12,500 strong, marched across open fields under blistering Union artillery. The ground shook with cannon fire. Men fell in waves, their battle flags collapsing into the dust. Only a fraction reached the Union line, and those who did were quickly overwhelmed. When the smoke cleared, Lee's army was shattered. Nearly 50,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing in just 3 days. Gettysburg was a Union victory, but at a cost almost too great to bear. The fields of Pennsylvania became a graveyard, and the war's outcome hung in the balance. Asterisk, while Gettysburg raged in the East, another crucial battle unfolded in the West. Union General Ulysses S. Grant had encircled the ex-Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg, Mississippi, the last major Confederate fortress on the river. For weeks, Union artillery pounded the city. Civilians and soldiers alike cowered in caves dug into the hillsides. Food ran out. Rats became meals. Disease spread through the starving population. On July 4, 1863, just 1 day after Pickett's failed charge at Gettysburg, Confederate Army at Vicksburg surrendered. The Union had seized control of the Mississippi River, cutting the Confederacy in two. Lincoln rejoiced, declaring, "The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea." The twin victories of Gettysburg and Vicksburg marked the turning point of the war. The South would never fully recover. Asterisk, in November 1863, President Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to dedicate a cemetery for the thousands who had fallen there. Standing on a simple wooden platform, he delivered a speech that lasted only 2 minutes, but it would echo through eternity. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Lincoln reminded the nation that the war was not just about twife. Union versus Confederacy was about the survival of freedom itself. The Civil War, he said, was a test of whether democracy could endure. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Those words, simple yet profound, became the soul of the Union cause. Asterisk, as armies clashed, life on the home front told another story of endurance and sacrifice. In the North, factories roared with production. churning out rifles, uniforms, and cannons. Women stepped into roles once reserved for men working in hospitals, factories, and farms. In the South, shortages bit deep. Blockades starved cities of supplies. Families went hungry, plantations lay in ruins, and enslaved people seized opportunities to escape. The war was not just on battlefields. It was in kitchens, in fields, in the hearts of mothers praying for sons who might never return. Letters carried words of love and despair across battle lines. Diaries captured the fears of women waiting by candlelight. The war touched every American life, binding the nation in a shared suffering that would never be forgotten. By the end of 1863, hope began to shift toward the Union. Yet the fighting was far from finished. Ahead lay the hardest year of 1864, when the war would grow even more brutal. And the path to victory would demand unimaginable sacrifice. Asterisk by 1864. The Civil War had become a storm without end. For 3 long years, North and South had clashed across hundreds of miles, yet the war still raged on. Both sides had suffered staggering losses, but neither was ready to surrender. President Abraham Lincoln faced re-election that year, and his political fate, and perhaps the Union's survival, rested on the battlefield. To win the war, Lincoln placed his trust in Ulysses S. Grant, appointing him as General-in-Chief of all Union armies. Grant was relentless. He believed in wearing down the Confederacy through constant pressure, no matter the cost. His opponent, Robert E. Lee, remained a master of defense, leading his men with unmatched loyalty. What followed was one of the most brutal campaigns in American history. Asterisk in May 1864. Grant launched the Overland Campaign. Its plan: push through Virginia, engage Lee's army at every turn, and march on Richmond, the Confederate capital. The first clash came in the tangled forests of the wilderness. The trees themselves seemed to fight, catching fire as bullets sparked blazes that trapped the wounded. Soldiers screamed as flames consumed them. The smoke was so thick men could not see their comrades. The wilderness was chaos on either side, gaining clear ground, but the losses were staggering. Unlike previous Union commanders, Grant did not retreat after defeat. Instead, he marched south, flanking Lee, and attacked again at Spotsylvania Courthouse. There, soldiers fought hand-to-hand in pouring rain, mud turning red beneath their boots. The bloody angle, a bend in the trenches, became a killing ground where men fought for 20 hours straight. Still, Grant pressed on. At Cold Harbor, thousands of Union soldiers charged fortified Confederate lines, only to be cut down within minutes. It was a massacre, men pinned to the ground under withering fire, writing their names on scraps of paper to be identified when they fell. Grant later admitted it was a mistake he would regret for the rest of his life. But despite the losses, Grant's army kept moving. Unlike Lee, Grant could replace his dead. The Confederacy could not. Asterisk by summer, Grant had driven Lee's army to Petersburg, a vital railroad hub supplying Richmond. What followed was not a single battle, but a siege lasting nearly 10 months. Both armies dug trenches stretching for miles. Resembling the future battlefields of World War I, soldiers lived in mud, tormented by heat, lice, and hunger. Snipers kept men pinned down. Cannon fire echoed day and night. In July, Union forces tried to break the stalemate with a daring plan. They dug a massive tunnel under the Confederate lines, packed it with explosives, and set it off. The ground erupted in a fiery blast, creating a crater 170 feet long. But poor coordination turned victory into disaster. Union troops charged into the crater, only to be trapped as Confederates fired down from the rim. The Battle of the Crater became a nightmare of slaughter. The siege dragged on, wearing down Lee's army, while Grant tightened his grip in Virginia. Another Union general was carving a path of destruction through the heart of the South. Asterisk. General William Tecumseh Sherman believed in a new kind of warfare: total war. His goal was not only to defeat Confederate armies, but to break the South's spirit by destroying its ability to wage war. In September 1864, Sherman captured Atlanta, a vital industrial hub. The victory electrified the North and secured Lincoln's re-election. But Sherman was not finished. That November, he began his infamous march to the sea. With 60,000 men, he cut a swath through Georgia, burning crops, tearing up railroads, and leaving towns in ruins. The sight of Union soldiers advancing across the countryside sent shockwaves through the South. Sherman's army lived off the land, seizing food and livestock, ensuring that Southern civilians felt the full weight of war. By December, Sherman reached Savannah, presenting the city to Lincoln as a Christmas gift. His march devastated Confederate morale, proving that the South could no longer protect its own heartland. Asterisk. By the end of 1864, the Confederacy was crumbling. Cities starved under blockades, railroads lay in ruins, and Lee's army was stretched thin. Yet the South refused to surrender. In the North, Lincoln's re-election secured the war effort, but at a terrible human cost. Families grieved for loved ones lost at Shiloh, Antietam, Gettysburg, and countless unnamed skirmishes. Graveyards filled faster than ever. Letters written by trembling hands carried news of death across the nation. But there was a sense that the end was near. The Union had momentum, resources, and resolve. The Confederacy had courage and desperation, but time was running out. 1865 would bring the final act. Surrender, assassination, and the dawn of a new America. By the close of 1860, the United States had reached a breaking point. The election of Abraham Lincoln as president triggered a wave of fear throughout the South. Lincoln had campaigned on halting the spread of slavery. And while he never promised its immediate abolition, Southern leaders viewed his victory as a direct threat to their way of life. On December 20, 1860, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union. The delegates gathered in Charleston, their decision swift and resolute. They would no longer remain under a government led by a man who opposed the institution they considered vital. The bells of Charleston rang that night, celebrating what they believed was the beginning of Southern independence. Within weeks, other states followed. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas declared their secession. By February of 1861, 7 states had left the Union. Leaders met in Montgomery, Alabama, and established the Confederate States of America. They drafted their own constitution, strikingly similar to the U.S. Constitution, but with a defining difference: slavery was explicitly protected. The Confederacy chose Jefferson Davis, a West Point graduate and former U.S. Senator from Mississippi, as its president. Davis, calm but stern, believed in the righteousness of the Southern cause. To many in the South, he was the symbol of their new nation. To the North, he was a rebel leader. Meanwhile, President-elect Lincoln remained silent. In Springfield, Illinois, waiting for his inauguration, he refused to acknowledge secession as legal, declaring that the Union was perpetual. To him, no state had the right to leave. Yet, in Washington, uncertainty and fear reigned. President James Buchanan, nearing the end of his term, did little to stop the secessions. His inaction allowed the Confederacy to grow stronger, establishing its government and seizing federal forts and arsenals across the South. The Union was crumbling before the eyes of its citizens. Families, businesses, and entire communities were divided. Some Southerners opposed secession, while some Northerners sympathized with the South. But as the winter of 1861 set in, the possibility of peaceful compromise seemed to vanish. The United States of America had split in two. The stage was set for a bloody conflict that would determine the very meaning of the nation's founding ideals. The Civil War was not just fought on land. From the very beginning, Abraham Lincoln understood that the Confederacy's strength depended heavily on trade cotton exports to Britain and France and imports of weapons, food, and manufactured goods to strangle the Southern economy. Lincoln's administration launched what became known as the Anaconda Plan, massive naval blockade designed to encircle the South, cut off its trade routes, and slowly squeeze it into submission. Union naval ships patrolled thousands of miles of coastline. From Virginia to Texas, the South's only hope lay in fast blockade runners, small, quick vessels that darted through gaps in Union patrols under the cover of darkness. These daring missions brought in limited supplies, but not enough to sustain a war. The naval blockade would soon prove devastating to the Confederate economy. In early 1862, Union forces under Ulysses S. Grant made a bold move into Tennessee. His targets, Fort Henry on the Tennessee River and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River. The capture of these two strongholds would give the Union direct access to the South's heartland. Fort Henry fell quickly to Union gunboats. But at Fort Donelson, Confederate forces fought bitterly, refusing to give up easily. After days of bloody fighting, Grant issued his now famous demand for unconditional and immediate surrender. The Confederates complied, handing over more than 12,000 men. Grant's victories marked the first major Union triumph of the war and earned him the nickname, Unconditional Surrender, Grant. More importantly, they opened the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers as vital invasion routes deep into Confederate territory. The Union's momentum carried it deeper into the South, but victory would not come without a terrible cost. In April 1862, Grant's army camped near a small church named Shiloh in Tennessee. Confederate forces under General Albert Sidney Johnston launched a surprise dawn attack. What followed was one of the bloodiest battles ever fought on American soil up to that point. The fighting raged through woods and fields, with men clashing at close range. Johnston was killed, but his army pushed Union troops to the brink of defeat. Only with reinforcements and sheer determination did Grant manage to turn the tide. When the smoke cleared, over 23,000 men were dead, wounded, or missing. The Battle of Shiloh shocked the nation. Both North and South realized the war would not be won quickly or cheaply. It would be a long, brutal struggle for survival. While Grant fought in the West, history was being made at sea. In March 1862, the Confederacy unveiled a terrifying new weapon. The CSS Virginia captured Union ship transformed into an ironclad warship, covered in iron plating. It seemed invincible against wooden Union ships. The Virginia smashed through the Union blockade at Hampton Roads, sinking ships with ease. But the next day, it met its match, the USS Monitor, a Union ironclad unlike anything ever seen. The two steel giants battled for hours, cannon fire bouncing harmlessly off their armored hulls. Though the fight ended in a stalemate, the age of wooden warships was over. Navies around the world realized the future belonged to iron and steam. In the East, General George B. McClellan finally launched his grand plan to capture Richmond, the Confederate capital, known as the Peninsula Campaign. His massive army of over 100,000 men moved up the Virginia Peninsula, pushing steadily toward the heart of the Confederacy. But McClellan was cautious to a fault. Constantly overestimating Confederate numbers, he delayed and hesitated, giving the South precious time to prepare. Confederate generals, including the rising star Robert E. Lee, exploited his timidity. In a series of engagements known as the 7 Days Battles, Lee's outnumbered army drove McClellan back. The Union came within sight of Richmond, but failed to take it. The war in the East remained far from over. Asterisk, by 1862, the war had grown brutal. In September, Confederate General Robert E. Lee launched an invasion of the North, marching into Maryland. Union forces under George B. McClellan intercepted him near a small creek called Antietam. The battle was a disaster in scale. Men fought in dense cornfields, along dusty roads, and across a sunken lane that would become forever known as Bloody Lane. More than 22,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing in a single day, the bloodiest in American history. Though tactically inconclusive, the battle gave President Lincoln the political momentum to announce the Emancipation Proclamation. From that day forward, the war became not just a fight to save the Union, but a battle to end slavery. Asterisk, on the first day of 1863, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all enslaved people in Confederate held territories were to be freed. This bold move changed the moral purpose of the war. It discouraged European powers, particularly Britain and France, from recognizing the Confederacy. It also allowed black men to enlist in the Union Army, bringing new strength, courage, and resolve to the fight. The proclamation did not immediately free all enslaved people, but it marked a historic turning point, tying the survival of the Union directly to the cause of human freedom. Asterisk, the war in the East remained deadly and difficult. In December 1862, Union forces under Ambrose Burnside attacked Confederate positions at Fredericksburg, Virginia. The Union Army faced a nearly impregnable line of Confederate troops entrenched on high ground. Wave after wave of soldiers charged uphill in the snow and mud, only to be cut down by deadly fire. The battle ended in a devastating defeat for the Union, with thousands of men killed or wounded in a futile assault. Fredericksburg highlighted the challenges of leadership, strategy, and morale in this new industrial age war, where firepower often outmatched courage. Asterisk, spring 1863 brought another dramatic confrontation. Union General Joseph Hooker faced Robert E. Lee at Chancellorsville, Virginia. Despite being outnumbered, Lee executed a bold and risky plan, splitting his forces and striking the Union Army from unexpected angles. The Confederates won a stunning victory, but at great cost. General Stonewall Jackson, Lee's trusted right hand, was mistakenly shot by his own men and died days later. Chancellorsville showed both the brilliance and the fragility of Confederate leadership. For the Union, the defeat was demoralizing, but it also underscored the need for a more aggressive and competent strategy. Asterisk, by July 1863, Robert E. Lee decided to invade the North again, hoping a major victory on Union soil would force the North to negotiate for peace. The clash came at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. For 3 days, some of the fiercest fighting of the war took place. On the final day, Lee ordered pickets charge a massive Confederate assault across open fields. Union forces entrenched and ready repelled the attack, inflicting massive casualties. Gettysburg ended Lee's invasion of the North and became a symbolic turning point of the war. The Confederate Army would retreat, and from that moment, momentum began to shift toward the Union. While Gettysburg raged in the North, the war in the West also reached a pivotal moment. Union General Ulysses S. Grant laid siege to Vicksburg, Mississippi, a Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. For over 6 weeks, Union forces encircled the city, cutting off food and supplies. Civilians and soldiers alike suffered extreme hunger and disease. On July 4, 1863, Confederate forces finally surrendered, giving the Union control of the Mississippi River and splitting the Confederacy in two. Vicksburg marked the rise of Grant as a brilliant strategist and foreshadowed his future command of all Union armies. Asterisk, later that year, President Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to dedicate a cemetery for the fallen. In a speech lasting just 2 minutes, he redefined the purpose of the war. 77 years ago, Lincoln reminded the nation that the Union's survival was inseparable from the principles of liberty and equality. The Gettysburg Address became one of the most memorable speeches in history, inspiring generations to come. By 1864, Ulysses S. Grant, now in command of all Union forces, launched the Overland Campaign against Robert E. Lee in Virginia. The campaign involved continuous, bloody battles at Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor. Grant's strategy was relentless. He refused to retreat, wearing down Lee's forces through sheer pressure. Despite enormous casualties, this approach was controversial but effective. Grant's determination demonstrated that the Union could endure the war's cost until victory was achieved. Meanwhile, in the South, General William T. Sherman implemented his infamous March to the Sea, starting in Atlanta. His army cut a 300-mile swath through Georgia, destroying infrastructure, railroads, and supplies. The march aimed to break the Confederacy's will to fight. Civilians were caught in the path of destruction, facing hunger and despair. Sherman's campaign demonstrated the harsh reality of total war and emphasized that victory required both military success and undermining the enemy's capacity to resist. The final year of the war focused on Petersburg, Virginia. Grant laid siege to the city, cutting off Confederate supply lines and engaging in trench warfare that foreshadowed World War I. The siege was grueling, with months of constant skirmishes, artillery bombardments, and immense suffering. Slowly, the Union tightened its grip, pushing Lee's army to the brink of collapse. Petersburg demonstrated that endurance, resources, and strategic planning would ultimately decide the war rather than brilliant but risky maneuvers alone. After months of siege at Petersburg, Union forces finally broke through the Confederate lines. On April 2, 1865, Richmond, the heart of the Confederacy, fell. Confederate leaders fled as fires engulfed parts of the city, leaving destruction and chaos behind. The fall of Richmond signaled that the Confederacy's defeat was imminent. Union soldiers, weary but resolute, marched through the streets, witnessing both the consequences of war and the fragile hope of reunification. 1 week later, at Appomattox Courthouse, General Robert E. Lee formally surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant. Grant's terms were generous. Confederate soldiers could return home with their horses, keeping their dignity intact. This act of mercy helped prevent further bloodshed and set a tone for national reconciliation. The Civil War, which had claimed over 620,000 lives, was over. But the scars on the nation were deep and enduring. Just days after the Confederate surrender, tragedy struck the nation. On April 14, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. The news sent shockwaves across the United States. Lincoln, the leader who had guided the nation through its darkest hours, would not witness Reconstruction or the promise of a reunited country. Mourning engulfed the nation as Americans grappled with both the joy of victory and the pain of losing their leader. Lincoln's assassination cast a long shadow over the post-war United States. Public funerals and memorials were held, with millions attending or following the procession in grief. Americans across the country reflected on the enormous cost of the war, the loss of loved ones, and the challenge of rebuilding a nation torn apart by conflict. Yet amidst the sorrow, a sense of purpose began to emerge: to honor the fallen by preserving the Union and ensuring the ideals of liberty and equality, for which so many had fought. Even as the war ended, the task of Reconstruction began. The nation faced the monumental challenge of rebuilding the South, integrating millions of newly freed African Americans into society, and reconciling former enemies. Amendments to the Constitution, including the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, laid the legal foundation for equality. Yet, tensions remained high, and the path toward true unity and civil rights would be long and fraught with struggle. The Civil War had ended, but its lessons, sacrifices, and the stories of heroism, tragedy, and resilience would forever shape America. Asterisk. In the aftermath of the war, the Freedmen's Bureau was established to assist formerly enslaved people. Its mission was to provide food, clothing, education, and medical care, helping millions navigate their newfound freedom. Schools were established for children and adults alike, offering literacy and vocational training. Despite resistance from many in the South, the Bureau became a beacon of hope for African Americans striving to build new lives in a society that had long denied them basic rights. Asterisk. The 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865, formally abolished slavery throughout the United States. It marked a monumental victory for freedom and justice, fulfilling the promise for which countless lives had been lost during the war. This legal change was only the beginning, as the nation would continue to struggle with equality, civil rights, and the deep-seated prejudices that persisted even after emancipation. Asterisk. Reconstruction was met with fierce opposition. Many white Southerners resisted changes, leading to the rise of violent groups such as the Ku Klux Klan. Federal troops were stationed in the South to protect African Americans and enforce new laws, but economic hardship, intimidation, and political resistance made progress slow and uneven. The struggle to rebuild trust and create a fair society proved just as challenging as winning the war itself. Asterisk. Across the country, Americans honored the sacrifices made by soldiers on both sides. National cemeteries were established, and monuments erected to commemorate the bravery and suffering endured. Memorials reminded the nation of the devastating human cost of the conflict and the importance of striving for unity, reconciliation, and lasting peace. Asterisk. The Civil War fundamentally reshaped the United States. Beyond the end of slavery, it strengthened federal authority, reshaped the economy, and left a legacy of regional and cultural memory. The lessons of courage, sacrifice, and the struggle for justice continue to influence American society for generations. Though the nation faced the difficult road of reconciliation, the hope for unity and equality became a guiding principle for the future. Asterisk. Amidst the chaos and destruction, soldiers recorded their experiences in diaries and letters. These writings provide a raw and personal perspective of the war, moments of fear, courage, longing for home, and reflections on the battles they endured. Through their words, we glimpse the humanity behind the uniforms, young men grappling with loss, families separated, and the constant hope of surviving another day. These letters would later serve as a bridge connecting future generations to the emotional truth of the Civil War. Asterisk. While men fought on the battlefields, women assumed critical roles at home. They managed farms and businesses, cared for the sick and wounded, and organized relief societies to support soldiers. Some served as nurses on the front lines, tending to injuries and disease with limited resources. Their courage and resilience kept communities intact, proving that the war's impact extended far beyond the battlefield. Asterisk. The youngest Americans were also profoundly affected. Children witnessed battles, lost family members, and endured scarcity and displacement. Despite the hardships, they often showed remarkable resilience. Many contributed to family survival, assisting with chores, tending animals, and even delivering messages for soldiers. Their stories reveal the quiet strength of a generation shaped by war. Asterisk. The participation of African American soldiers was a turning point in both the war and American society. Regiments like the 54th Massachusetts demonstrated bravery and skill, challenging the prejudices of the time. Their service not only advanced the Union's cause, but also sent a powerful message about equality and the potential of freed African Americans to shape the nation's future. Asterisk letters from the battlefield often conveyed both hope and heartbreak. Soldiers shared news of skirmishes, the loss of friends, and reflections on mortality. Families treasured these letters as tangible connections to loved ones in a world dominated by uncertainty. Through their words, the personal cost of war becomes undeniable, a testament to the courage, sorrow, and resilience experienced on every front of the conflict. Asterisk. The Battle of Antietam in September 1862 marked one of the bloodiest single days in American history. With over 22,000 casualties, though tactically inconclusive, it provided a crucial strategic victory for the Union. This battle gave President Lincoln the confidence to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, signaling a shift in the war's purpose. From solely preserving the Union to also fighting for the freedom of enslaved people. Gettysburg was the turning point of the Civil War. From July 1st to July 3rd, 1863, Union forces repelled General Lee's invasion of the North. The battle left over 50,000 soldiers dead, wounded, or missing, cementing its place in history as a symbol of sacrifice and endurance. Lincoln would later honor the fallen with the Gettysburg Address, forever linking this battlefield to the nation's ideals of unity and freedom. Asterisk. The Siege of Vicksburg was a critical Union victory. By gaining control of the Mississippi River, though North effectively split the Confederacy in two, the siege tested the endurance of both soldiers and civilians alike. Starvation, disease, and constant bombardment highlighted the grim realities of prolonged warfare. This victory, paired with Gettysburg, shifted momentum firmly toward the Union. Asterisk. General William Tecumseh. Sherman's march to the sea demonstrated the Union's strategy of total war. By targeting infrastructure and resources, Sherman aimed to break the Confederacy's will to fight. The march devastated Georgia, leaving a trail of destruction but also hastening the end of the war. It became a controversial yet pivotal moment in the conflict, illustrating the harsh realities of modern warfare. Asterisk. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, signaling the effective end of the Civil War. The surrender was marked by dignity and mutual respect, with Grant allowing Confederate soldiers to return home with their personal possessions. This moment symbolized not only the cessation of fighting, but the beginning of the long process of national healing and reconstruction. Asterisk. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued in January 1863, began the formal process of ending slavery in the United States. While it did not immediately free all enslaved people, it transformed the war's purpose and gave hope to millions. Thousands of African Americans joined the Union Army, a moral weight to the North's struggle. Their courage and resilience became a defining element of the conflict, showcasing that the fight for freedom was inseparable from the fight for the Union. Asterisk. On April 14, 1865, just days after Lee's surrender, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. The nation was plunged into grief, mourning a leader who had guided them through the most perilous conflict in their history. Lincoln's death underscored the deep divisions that remained, even in victory, and reminded the nation that rebuilding unity would be a daunting task. Asterisk. With the war over, the United States entered the Reconstruction era, a period focused on rebuilding the South, integrating freed slaves into society, and redefining citizenship and rights. New amendments to the Constitution, including the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, were milestones. Yet the era was fraught with political tension, resistance, and the struggle for equality, highlighting that the battle for freedom extended beyond the battlefield. Asterisk. The Civil War accelerated social and economic transformations across the nation. The North's industrial capacity surged, while the South faced the challenge of transitioning from a slave-based economy to one of free labor. Railroads, telegraphs, and new industries began reshaping America, setting the stage for the Gilded Age. Yet, lingering resentments and inequalities would continue to influence politics and society for generations. The Civil War left an indelible mark on the United States. Over 620,000 soldiers perished, countless families were shattered, and the nation was irrevocably changed. It established the supremacy of the federal government, abolished slavery, and set a precedent for civil rights struggles in the future. Memorials, literature, and historical accounts continue to remind Americans of the sacrifice, courage, and enduring lessons from this defining chapter of history. Beyond the grand battles and famous generals, the war was defined by the daily lives of ordinary soldiers. Men faced harsh conditions, limited rations, disease, and the constant threat of combat. Letters home reveal homesickness, fears, and small acts of humanity. Despite the hardships, bonds of brotherhood were forged, showing resilience and courage. In the face of relentless adversity, women became the backbone of the home front. They managed households, farms, and businesses while their husbands were away. Many served as nurses, helping care for the wounded, while others organized supplies and aid for soldiers. Their work was critical to both Northern and Southern war efforts, and the conflict forever altered perceptions of women's roles in American society. The participation of African American soldiers in the Union Army was a turning point. Regiments like the 54th Massachusetts displayed extraordinary bravery. Even in the face of unequal treatment and prejudice, freedmen contributed not only militarily but also in rebuilding communities, establishing schools, and asserting their newfound rights, laying the foundation for future civil rights movements. While Gettysburg and Antietam dominate history books, hundreds of smaller battles and skirmishes shaped the course of the war. Places like Chickamauga, Shiloh, and Fredericksburg tested strategy, endurance, and leadership. These lesser-known confrontations were often brutal and decisive, highlighting the widespread reach and unpredictability of the war across the nation. Civilians, particularly in the South, bore immense suffering. Homes and towns were destroyed, crops burned, and communities uprooted. Refugees fled, seeking safety, while families struggled to survive amid scarcity and uncertainty. The Civil War's devastation was not limited to soldiers. Its impact reshaped the social and economic fabric of the entire nation. By 1864, Ulysses S. Grant had become the Union's top general, known for his relentless strategy and unyielding resolve. Grant understood that the war required sustained pressure on Confederate forces. His leadership in campaigns, like Vicksburg and later the Overland Campaign, demonstrated his willingness to absorb losses strategically, aiming to exhaust the Confederacy's resources and manpower. On the Confederate side, Robert E. Lee remained a brilliant tactician. His campaigns in 1864 and 1865, particularly in the Wilderness and Petersburg, showcased both his skill and the growing desperation of the South. Despite tactical brilliance, Lee faced severe shortages of men, supplies, and morale, making victory increasingly unlikely. His decisions in these final campaigns would determine the Confederacy's fate. The Siege of Petersburg became one of the war's longest and most grueling engagements. Union forces under Grant slowly wore down Confederate defenses through trench warfare, cutting supply lines and forcing Lee into a defensive struggle. The siege exemplified the grinding nature of late-war combat, where strategy, attrition, and endurance replaced dramatic, large-scale battles. Meanwhile, General William Tecumseh Sherman executed his famous March to the Sea, a campaign of total war designed to break the South's will to fight. His forces moved from Atlanta to Savannah, destroying infrastructure and resources critical to the Confederate war effort. Sherman's march demonstrated a shift toward psychological and economic warfare, targeting the civilian capacity to support armies. By late 1864, the momentum had decisively shifted in favor of the Union. Grant's persistent campaigns, combined with Sherman's destructive march, left Confederate forces stretched thin and demoralized. The combination of strategic offensives, attrition, and superior resources made the eventual surrender of the Confederacy increasingly inevitable. The Union's relentless siege finally broke through Confederate lines at Petersburg in April 1865. Exhausted and outnumbered, Lee's forces were forced to abandon the city, retreating westward in a last-ditch effort to regroup. The fall of Petersburg marked the beginning of the end. The Confederate Army, once a formidable force, was now fragmented, low on supplies, and struggling to maintain cohesion. After days of pursuit, Grant's forces cornered Lee's army at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. The two generals met in a small parlor, where Lee formally surrendered to Grant. Grant's terms were generous. Confederate soldiers were allowed to return home with their personal possessions and horses. The surrender symbolized not only a military defeat, but also the hope for reconciliation between North and South. President Abraham Lincoln, who had tirelessly guided the Union through its darkest hours, envisioned a country healed and reunited. His leadership, compassion, and vision for Reconstruction offered a path toward national unity. Tragically, Lincoln's life was cut short when he was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. On April 14, 1865, his death plunged the nation into mourning, and the task of reconstruction fell to others. Testing the resilience of the country Lincoln had fought to preserve. The Civil War left the United States in ruins. Cities burned, economies shattered, and millions of lives lost. Yet, it also resulted in monumental changes. The abolition of slavery, constitutional amendments redefining citizenship and rights, and the beginning of the long, challenging road toward civil rights. Communities across the nation struggled to rebuild. Former slaves faced new freedoms, but also violent resistance. The seeds of reconciliation and reform had been planted. But the journey toward equality and unity would take generations. The Civil War remains one of the most transformative events in American history. Its battles, sacrifices, and leaders are remembered not only for their military significance, but for the profound impact on the nation's social, political, and moral landscape. From 1861 to 1865, the United States endured the crucible of war, tested its ideals, and emerged changed forever. The lessons of courage, resilience, and the cost of division continue to resonate today, reminding us of the fragility and strength of the American experiment. The Civil War began with the bombardment of Fort Sumter in April 1861, located in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. This Confederate attack marked the first military engagement of the war. Union soldiers, outnumbered and cut off from supplies, eventually surrendered. While no lives were lost in combat, the event ignited a firestorm of mobilization on both sides. States across the Union quickly began raising troops, signaling that a long and bloody conflict had begun. Battle of Shiloh, April 1862. Union and Confederate forces clashed in Tennessee, resulting in massive casualties, over 23,000 combined. The battle shocked the nation with its scale and demonstrated that the war would be far deadlier than anyone had imagined. Battle of Antietam, September 1862, fought in Maryland. Antietam became the bloodiest single day in American history, with more than 22,000 casualties. The Union victory allowed President Lincoln to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, redefining the war's purpose as a fight against slavery, not just a struggle to preserve the Union. Battle of Gettysburg, July 1863. 3 days of intense fighting in Pennsylvania ended with a decisive Union victory, halting Confederate General Robert E. Lee's invasion of the North. Gettysburg became a symbol of sacrifice and determination. With over 50,000 soldiers killed, wounded, or missing. Siege of Vicksburg, May-July 1863. Union forces under General Ulysses S. Grant captured the strategic city of Vicksburg, Mississippi, gaining control of the Mississippi River and effectively splitting the Confederacy in two. This victory demonstrated the strategic importance of controlling waterways and crippling Confederate supply lines. Battle of Atlanta, July 1864. Union forces, led by General William T. Sherman, captured Atlanta after a series of fierce battles. The victory boosted Northern morale and helped secure Lincoln's re-election later that year. Sherman's march to the sea, November-December 1864. Sherman's forces marched from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia, using a scorched earth strategy to destroy infrastructure, supplies, and morale. The march demonstrated total war tactics and broke the South's ability to sustain prolonged conflict. The final year saw the collapse of Confederate resistance. After Petersburg fell, Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865 ended major hostilities. Remaining Confederate forces surrendered in the weeks that followed, bringing the 4-year conflict to a close. The battles of the Civil War were not only military engagements, they were turning points that reshaped the nation, defined leadership, and set the stage for America's Reconstruction and future civil rights struggles. While soldiers fought on distant battlefields, life at home changed dramatically. Families in both the North and South faced shortages, inflation, and the constant anxiety of losing loved ones. Women took on new roles, managing farms, businesses, and households alone. Many also became nurses, volunteering in hospitals and makeshift medical facilities, providing critical care to wounded soldiers. Children often grew up quickly, taking on responsibilities to support families. And communities learned to cope with the devastation of a nation at war. Life in the camps was harsh and often monotonous. Soldiers dealt with poor sanitation, limited rations, and exposure to harsh weather. Disease was a greater killer than bullets, with illnesses like dysentery, typhoid, and pneumonia spreading rapidly. Despite these challenges, camaraderie and loyalty formed strong bonds. Soldiers wrote letters home, shared stories, and maintained traditions to preserve morale. Music, newspapers, and games helped fill long periods of inactivity between battles. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 transformed the war. It declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territories were free. This shifted the conflict's moral purpose and allowed African Americans to join the Union Army. With nearly 200,000 serving by the war's end, their contributions were vital to the Union victory and signaled a profound social change. Even as the struggle for equality continued long after the war, Lincoln faced enormous political pressure. Balancing the desires of the radical Republicans, Northern Democrats, and war-weary citizens required careful decision-making. Southern states, meanwhile, had to navigate internal dissent and manage their limited resources. The Confederate government struggled to maintain unity, finance the war, and mobilize its population effectively. Even before the war ended, discussions of post-war Reconstruction began. Questions arose about reintegrating Southern states, addressing the rights of freedmen, and rebuilding the economy. Though the war ended in 1865, the political and social transformations it triggered were only beginning. The seeds of change planted during these years would influence American society for generations, shaping the fight for civil rights, citizenship, and national unity. By early 1865, the Confederacy was crumbling. General Robert E. Lee, facing dwindling supplies and exhausted troops, surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Court House on April 9, 1865. This act effectively ended major hostilities. While scattered Confederate forces continued to resist briefly, the Union's victory was undeniable. The nation, however, faced the daunting task of rebuilding and healing the wounds of a bitter and costly conflict. Just days after Lee's surrender, on April 14, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth. Lincoln's death shocked the nation and complicated the early stages of Reconstruction. His vision for reunifying the country and protecting the rights of freedmen was left in the hands of his successor, Andrew Johnson, who would face significant challenges and political opposition. Millions of formerly enslaved African Americans faced a new reality. Freedom was official, but equality was far from guaranteed. The Freedmen's Bureau was established to assist with education, health care, and legal matters. African Americans began building schools, churches, and communities, asserting their rights even amidst rising resistance from former Confederates. 3 crucial amendments reshaped the American legal landscape. 13th Amendment, 1865, abolished slavery entirely. 14th Amendment, 1868, granted citizenship and equal protection under the law. 15th Amendment, 1870, ensured African American men the right to vote. These amendments were milestones, yet enforcing them proved contentious and often violent. The South. Southern states were divided into military districts under Union control. Efforts to rebuild infrastructure, implement new laws, and integrate freedmen met fierce opposition. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged to intimidate African Americans and resist Reconstruction policies. Violence, voter suppression, and political tension mark the era, illustrating that the Civil War's end was not the end of struggle for equality. The South's economy, devastated by war, relied on rebuilding agriculture and industry. Sharecropping became widespread, often trapping freedmen in cycles of debt and poverty. In the North, industrial growth accelerated, fueled by wartime innovations and infrastructure expansion. The nation's social fabric, however, remained fragile, with lingering divisions between regions, races, and political factions. The Civil War fundamentally reshaped the United States. The Union was preserved. Slavery was abolished, though civil rights remained contested for decades. Federal power expanded, setting precedents for future governance. The war's memory shaped culture, literature, and national identity. Its lessons about unity, justice, and human cost continue to resonate, influencing American politics and society even today. Beyond the battles and political decisions, the Civil War was shaped by the experiences of ordinary soldiers. Letters, diaries, and memoirs reveal the daily hardships of camp life, the fear and chaos of battle, and the camaraderie that developed. Among men facing life-or-death situations, Union and Confederate soldiers alike endured hunger, disease, and exposure, often writing home to loved ones about the horrors they faced and the small moments of humanity they could find amid destruction. Women played a crucial role during the Civil War. They managed farms, businesses, and households while men were away fighting. Many became nurses, tending to the wounded in hospitals and on battlefields. Figures like Clara Barton, who later founded the American Red Cross, emerged as heroes, showing courage and resilience in times of crisis. By the latter part of the war, African American troops joined the Union Army, forming regiments such as the 54th Massachusetts Infantry. Their participation challenged perceptions of race and ability and symbolized the fight for freedom and equality. Despite facing discrimination, lower pay, and higher risks. Their bravery contributed significantly to Union victories and the broader push for emancipation. The war left an indelible mark on American culture. Songs, poems, and literature captured the grief, heroism, and nationalism of the era. Writers like Walt Whitman and Louisa May Alcott documented the human cost of war, providing insights that still resonate today. Memorials, monuments, and reenactments became part of the ongoing cultural memory, preserving stories for future generations. After the war, the South developed the lost cause narrative, portraying the Confederacy as honorable and minimizing the role of slavery as a cause of the conflict. This narrative influenced education, public memory, and regional identity, shaping debates about the Civil War's meaning for decades. Understanding these narratives is essential to grasp the ongoing struggles over historical memory in America. Rebuilding the nation involved not only physical reconstruction, but also social and political reconciliation. Veterans reunions, national cemeteries, and commemorative events sought to honor the fallen while bridging divides. The process was uneven and fraught with tension, but it laid the groundwork for a more united nation in the long term. The Civil War remains a touchstone in American history. Schools teach it as a story of conflict, courage, and transformation. Films, books, and documentaries revisit the era, emphasizing its complexity and the lessons it offers about freedom, unity, and human cost. Understanding the war's history helps Americans grapple with contemporary issues of race, regional identity, and the meaning of liberty. From the opening shots at Fort Sumter to the surrender at Appomattox. The Civil War reshaped the United States. It preserved the Union, ended slavery, and redefined the role of government. Yet it also exposed deep social fractures and left legacies of inequality that would persist for generations. The story of 1861 to 1865 is not just about battles and generals. It is about people, ideas, and the enduring struggle for justice and unity. While battles like Gettysburg and Antietam dominate history books, countless smaller skirmishes shaped the course of the war. Engagements at places like Fort Wagner, Pourryville, and New Market involved intense fighting with significant strategic consequences. Though overshadowed, these conflicts tested leadership, tactics, and the resolve of soldiers. The Siege of Vicksburg, May July 1863, demonstrated the importance of strategy and patience. Union forces under General Ulysses S. Grant surrounded the city, cutting off supplies and compelling Confederate forces to surrender. This victory gave the Union control over the Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy and proving Grant's military genius. Chickamauga. September 1863 was one of the bloodiest battles in the Western Theater, though the Confederates claimed victory. Union forces managed to retreat in order and later regroup, demonstrating resilience. The battle highlighted how regional theaters of war could profoundly affect national strategy. Not all heroes were generals commanding large armies. Figures like Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, who defended Little Round Top at Gettysburg, and Nathan Bedford Forrest, whose cavalry raids disrupted Union supply lines, played pivotal roles in shaping outcomes. Their decisions often turned the tide in crucial moments. Civilians in both the North and South made sacrifices that impacted the war. Farmers, factory workers, and local militias provided food, supplies, and intelligence. Women organized aid societies and maintained the economy, demonstrating that victory depended on more than just the soldiers on the battlefield. African American soldiers and laborers often served in conditions of extreme danger and discrimination. Units like the 54th Massachusetts became symbols of courage, while many others worked as laborers, building fortifications, transporting supplies, and performing essential but often overlooked duties. Their collective efforts reshaped perceptions of African American capability and rights. Asterisk in regions like Missouri and Kansas. Guerrilla warfare added chaos to the larger conflict. Groups like Quantrills, raiders, engaged in ambushes, raids, and unpredictable attacks. These struggles illustrated how the Civil War extended beyond formal battlefields and deeply affected local populations. Asterisk. The Civil War saw innovations such as ironclad ships, railroads, telegraphs, and rifled muskets. These advancements changed how battles were fought, improving communication, mobility, and firepower. While not always decisive, technological progress influenced tactics and outcomes throughout the conflict. Asterisk medical care during the war was primitive. Amputations were common, and diseases claimed more lives than bullets. Field hospitals, makeshift ambulances, and dedicated nurses attempted to mitigate suffering. Simultaneously, logistics moving food, ammunition, and troops was a constant challenge, with supply lines often targeted by enemy forces. Asterisk countless individuals performed heroic acts that went unrecognized. From messengers who delivered vital intelligence under fire to soldiers who risked their lives to save comrades. The war was full of courage and sacrifice that history sometimes overlooks. These acts, though small in scale, collectively shaped the fate of the nation. Asterisk President Abraham Lincoln had to maintain a delicate balance between preserving the Union, appeasing different political factions, and managing public opinion. From the outset of the war, Lincoln faced pressure from radical Republicans who demanded a more aggressive approach to ending slavery, and from Northern Democrats who often opposed prolonged conflict. His decisions such as issuing the Emancipation Proclamation were carefully calculated not only as moral statements but as strategic moves to weaken the Confederacy and prevent foreign recognition of the Southern states. Lincoln also relied heavily on cabinet members with differing viewpoints, including Secretary of State William H. Seward, to navigate the complex web of domestic and international politics. He often faced criticism for indecision, yet his ability to manage dissent ultimately strengthened the Union's political position. Asterisk. The Confederacy placed great hope on international recognition. Leaders believed that Britain and France, reliant on Southern cotton for their textile industries, might intervene on their behalf. Confederate diplomats, such as James Mason and John Slidell, were sent abroad to negotiate alliances. However, European governments were cautious. Public opinion in Britain and France leaned toward the Union because of anti-slavery sentiment, especially after the Emancipation Proclamation, which framed the war as a moral struggle rather than a purely political one. Despite Confederate optimism, the South failed to secure the recognition and support it desperately needed, leaving it increasingly isolated and vulnerable. Asterisk. The Union worked actively to prevent European intervention. William Seward, Lincoln's Secretary of State, implemented a sophisticated strategy of diplomacy and influence. Union representatives in Britain and France emphasized that supporting the Confederacy could lead to a long, costly war and might damage trade relations with the industrialized North. The Union also leveraged naval power to block Confederate ports, reducing cotton exports and demonstrating that Europe's economic interests would be better served by neutrality. These diplomatic successes ensured that the Confederacy remained largely isolated on the world stage. Asterisk. A major test of Union diplomacy came in 1861 with the Trent Affair. Union forces intercepted a British ship carrying Confederate envoys to Europe. Britain demanded their release, threatening war if the Union refused. Lincoln and his advisors carefully navigated the crisis, releasing the envoys while asserting Union authority, thus avoiding an international conflict that could have shifted the war dramatically. This episode highlighted how fragile the global political environment was and how a single misstep could have forced the United States to fight a war on two fronts against the Confederacy and a foreign power. Asterisk. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation 1863 was a turning point not only morally but also diplomatically, by declaring freedom for enslaved people in Confederate-held territories. Lincoln reframed the war as a struggle against slavery, making it politically and morally difficult for European nations to support the Confederacy. The proclamation also allowed African Americans to enlist in the Union Army, strengthening military capacity while simultaneously reshaping international perceptions. Britain and France, already cautious about slavery, refrained from recognizing the Confederacy, demonstrating how domestic policy could influence global diplomacy. Asterisk. The northern political landscape was deeply divided. Radical Republicans pushed for the immediate abolition of slavery and harsher measures against the South. Moderate Republicans focused on preserving the Union while gradually addressing slavery. War Democrats supported the fight but resisted radical social change. Peace Democrats, also known as Copperheads, openly opposed the war, advocating negotiation with the Confederacy. Lincoln had to carefully maneuver among these factions, often using executive powers such as suspending habeas corpus and controlling military appointments to maintain authority. His political skill was as crucial as battlefield victories in keeping the Union together. Asterisk. The Confederate States faced significant internal political difficulties. President Jefferson Davis struggled to balance state rights with centralized military authority. Many Southern governors resisted conscription laws or taxes, prioritizing local interests over national strategy. This decentralized power structure, coupled with dwindling resources, hindered the Confederacy's ability to sustain a coordinated war effort. Even as Confederate generals achieved battlefield victories, political fragmentation weakened their overall position. Asterisk. The American Civil War was closely watched by foreign powers. European observers analyzed the conflict for lessons on military strategy, technological innovation, and political management. The war's outcome influenced colonial policies, military doctrine, and industrial development abroad. The Union's ability to prevent foreign intervention preserved not only its territorial integrity, but also set a precedent for the modern concept of sovereignty in international relations. Asterisk. Newspapers, pamphlets, and political cartoons played a key role in shaping both domestic and international perceptions. Northern publications highlighted Union victories and moral imperatives, while Southern papers emphasized valor and resistance. Lincoln and his cabinet understood the power of media to influence public opinion at home and abroad, using carefully crafted statements to strengthen the Union cause. Asterisk. By the war's end, it was clear that diplomacy, public perception, and political maneuvering had been as vital as battlefield tactics. The Union emerged stronger not only because of military victories, but also because of strategic, political, and diplomatic actions that prevented foreign intervention, maintained public support, and ensured that the war's moral and political goals were clear. Asterisk. In 1864, Ulysses S. Grant was appointed General-in-Chief of all Union armies. Unlike his predecessors, Grant pursued a coordinated strategy of simultaneous offensives across multiple fronts. His approach aimed to stretch Confederate resources, force them into defensive positions, and apply constant pressure. Grant understood that victory required relentless engagement, even at the cost of heavy casualties, a strategy that would later be criticized but ultimately proved effective. Asterisk. Grant launched the Overland Campaign, moving against Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Battles like the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, and Cold Harbor were marked by extreme brutality, while Union casualties were high. Grant's persistent offensives prevented Lee from reinforcing other Confederate armies, gradually weakening the South's capacity to sustain the war. Asterisk. Meanwhile, William Tecumseh Sherman advanced through the South with his famous March to the Sea. Employing total war tactics designed to destroy Confederate infrastructure and morale, Sherman's forces captured Atlanta, critical industrial and railroad hub, before marching toward Savannah, leaving a trail of destruction that disrupted Southern supply lines. The march demonstrated that war was no longer limited to battlefields but extended to civilian resources supporting the war effort. By early 1865, the Confederacy was severely weakened. Food shortages and inflation devastated civilian populations. Troop numbers were drastically reduced due to casualties and desertions. Political disunity continued to undermine coordinated efforts. Lee's army, despite brilliant defensive maneuvers, could no longer match the Union's manpower and resources. On April 3, 1865, Union forces captured Richmond, the Confederate capital. The Confederate government fled, leaving behind documents, supplies, and civilians in chaos. The capture marked a psychological and strategic turning point, signaling that the Confederacy's defeat was imminent. On April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. Grant's terms were generous. Confederate soldiers could return home with personal property, horses for spring planting, and no fear of prosecution. This leniency reflected a Union desire to begin healing the nation rather than deepen resentments. Tragically, just days later, on April 14, 1865, President Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. Lincoln's death shocked the nation, leaving the country without its guiding leader during the fragile post-war period. His assassination intensified Northern grief, but also solidified his status as a martyr for unity and emancipation. The South was in ruins. Cities like Atlanta, Richmond, and Charleston lay devastated. Agricultural systems were destroyed, causing widespread famine. Social structures were upended with the end of slavery, leaving freed people and former slaveholders to navigate an uncertain future. Union soldiers returned home, often carrying wounds and trauma, while Southern populations faced a challenge of rebuilding without the economic foundation of slavery. Even before the war officially ended, discussions about rebuilding the nation and integrating formerly enslaved people into society began. The Freedmen's Bureau was established to provide assistance, education, and legal support. However, political tensions between Lincoln's vision of reconciliation and the radical Republicans' push for civil rights and punishment of the South foreshadowed decades of struggle. The Civil War had claimed over 600,000 lives and reshaped the United States. Slavery was abolished, legally and nationally, through the 13th Amendment. Federal authority was strengthened, ensuring that states could not secede at will. The war accelerated technological and industrial changes, setting the stage for post-war modernization. Yet the nation remained deeply scarred, with lingering divisions that would influence politics, race relations, and regional identity for generations. After the war, the United States entered a period known as Reconstruction 1865 to 1877. The nation faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding the South, integrating formerly enslaved people into society, and redefining the relationship between the federal government and the states. The Reconstruction era was spiked by both hope and conflict. While laws and amendments promised freedom and equality, entrenched social attitudes and economic pressures created obstacles that would persist for decades. The Freedmen's Bureau, established in 1865, sought to provide food, clothing, and medical care to freed people, help freed individuals secure employment and fair wages, establish schools to educate former slaves, many of whom had been denied literacy. Education became a cornerstone of freedom. empowering individuals to participate more fully in society. However, Southern resistance often limited the bureaus. Effectiveness. The war's end brought monumental constitutional changes. 13th Amendment 1865 abolished slavery entirely. 14th Amendment 1868 guaranteed citizenship and equal protection under the law. 15th Amendment 1870 prohibited denying the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. These amendments laid the legal foundation for civil rights, though enforcement would prove inconsistent and contentious. Despite legal changes, many Southern states enacted black codes, restrictive laws designed to limit the mobility and employment opportunities of freed people. Maintain a labor system resembling slavery, undermine African Americans' political power. Resistance from the federal government led to military occupation in parts of the South and efforts by radical Republicans to enforce Reconstruction policies. The period saw intense political battles. President Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln, favored a lenient approach toward the South. Clashing with Congress, radical Republicans sought to protect African Americans' rights and punish former Confederates. Impeachment proceedings against Johnson reflected the deep divisions over Reconstruction policies. Reconstruction governments, often led by freed people and Northern transplants, implemented reforms, but faced persistent violence from groups like the Ku Klux Klan. The South's economy was devastated, with destroyed plantations, railroads, and infrastructure. Many freed people became sharecroppers, working land they did not own for a share of the crops. This system often trapped families in debt and dependency, limiting economic mobility despite legal freedom. Southern states struggled to rebuild. Industry and transportation networks. Slowing recovery. Reconstruction brought new opportunities and cultural change. African Americans formed churches, schools, and communities, creating spaces for leadership and self-expression. Northern investment introduced railroads, factories, and industry, slowly transforming Southern society. Tensions between progressive reformers and conservative Southerners highlighted the struggle between old and new social orders. Reconstruction officially ended in 1877 with a Compromise of 1877, which resolved the contested 1876 presidential election in favor of Rutherford B. Hayes, required the withdrawal of federal troops from the South, effectively ending federal enforcement of civil rights. This marked the beginning of Jim Crow laws, disenfranchisement, and racial segregation that would dominate the South for nearly a century. The Civil War's impact endured. The United States remained a single, indivisible nation, reinforcing federal authority. Slavery was abolished, but racial inequality persisted. Technological, economic, and social changes accelerated, shaping the modern United States. The war's memory influenced literature, politics, and national identity, ensuring that future generations would grapple with its meaning. The era became a touchstone for debates about freedom, equality, and the responsibilities of citizenship. Lessons that continue to resonate today. In reflecting on the Civil War, the nation faced unprecedented loss and devastation, but also profound transformation. Leaders, soldiers, and ordinary citizens contributed to a historic turning point that reshaped American society. The struggle for justice and equality that began in Reconstruction continues in modern times. Rooted in the lessons of 1861 to 1865, the Civil War story is not only one of blood and conflict, but also of resilience, courage, and the enduring pursuit of liberty. The Civil War claimed over 600,000 lives. More than any other conflict in U.S. history, families were torn apart, communities destroyed, and countless soldiers returned home wounded, both physically and mentally. Entire towns, especially in the South, lay in ruins, their farms, factories, and homes decimated, the suffering extended beyond the battlefield. Disease, famine, and displacement affected millions, leaving scars that would linger for generations. Children grew up without fathers, women managed farms and households alone, and veterans struggled to reintegrate into society. The Civil War fundamentally changed the United States. The abolition of slavery marked the end of one of the darkest chapters in American history. The 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, legally freed millions of African Americans. But the struggle for equality had only begun. The war also strengthened federal authority. States could no longer claim the right to secede, and the power of the central government expanded, particularly in enforcing civil rights and regulating commerce. Reconstruction 1865 to 1877 attempted to rebuild the South and integrate newly freed African Americans into society. Schools, churches, and businesses began to rise from the ashes. African Americans participated in politics, with some elected to public office, shaping policies for the first time. Yet, Reconstruction faced fierce resistance. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan sought to suppress African Americans through intimidation and violence. Segregation and systemic inequality persisted, creating struggles that would last well into the 20th century. The memory of the Civil War continues to shape American identity. Monuments, museums, literature, and films memorialize battles, leaders, and ordinary soldiers. Historians debate motives, strategies, and consequences, keeping the story alive for new generations. Civil War history teaches lessons about unity, division, human rights, and the cost of conflict. It reminds us that progress often comes at immense sacrifice, and that freedom and equality require vigilance to preserve. The war's outcomes still influence the U.S. today. Civil rights movements draw inspiration from the abolition of slavery. Federal authority and constitutional interpretation are rooted in wartime decisions. National identity as a unified country, despite differences, was forged in this crucible. The sacrifices of soldiers, civilians, and leaders paved the way for a transformed nation, one that continues to grapple with the ideals of liberty and equality envisioned more than 150 years ago. The Civil War is more than a historical event. It is a story of human courage, suffering, and resilience. From the bloody battlefields to the halls of Congress, from the lives of freed slaves to the struggles of grieving families, the war reshaped a nation forever. It reminds us that freedom is precious, unity is fragile, and the lessons of history must be remembered so that the mistakes of the past are not repeated. The story of 1861 to 1865 is a story of America itself, a nation tested, divided, and ultimately transformed, leaving a legacy that continues to define the United States today.